Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast, where we answer key questions in dating, relationships, success, and fulfillment, and explore the psychology of masculinity. Now, here's your host, world-renowned therapist and life coach, David Tian.
Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast. I'm David Tian, your host. And in this episode, we're going to be diving deep into how to uncover, understand, and integrate your shadow, or more accurately, your shadow parts. Why? Because if you don't do it, if you don't get to know your shadow and integrate your shadow parts, then you will always be living with inner conflict at some level. And because of this inner conflict, this inner sabotaging, you're going to require lots of willpower and discipline to achieve your goals in life. And unless you integrate your shadow parts, you'll never be able to experience true harmony, true inner harmony, and you won't be able to step into the fullness of your potential or your power. You will instead be living a one-dimensional life, limited to only the more dominant aspects of yourself and unable to access the hidden power in the other half of yourself. And you'll never really be able to be at ease and experience that freedom within. Emotional freedom, psychological freedom, because there's always going to be, if you haven't integrated your shadow, there's always going to be some resistance to some part of you. And this will prevent you from experiencing long-term fulfillment or lasting happiness. So in this episode, I'm going to be introducing 3 big points about the shadow and the shadow parts and explaining what it's all about and why it's so important. But before we dive into that, I just want to take a quick moment here to point out 2 very important myths to draw your attention to. And the first myth is a variation of the well-known what you see is what you get. This myth is called the myth of what you see is all there is. The myth of what you see is all there is. The shadow and the shadow parts are in the unconscious, and they're, by definition, hidden from us from our day-to-day lives. The shadow is so named because it's in the shadows. These parts of us are hidden. We have disowned them. We've exiled them. So they're not obvious to us. And almost all self-help, life coaching focuses on what's obvious, actually. Most life coaching is really straightforward and common sense. And one life coach that I likes to say, it may seem common sense, but it's not common practice. So there is some use to it, for sure. But what we're getting at here is much deeper. And a lot of people, especially achievers, who are very focused on logic and rationality and intellectualizing, which is a lot of my listeners, probably you listening. And I definitely identify with, I have a lot of intellectual parts that lead my life. And part of what I've discovered over the past decade and a half has been the importance of the unconscious. And the thing about the unconscious is that going about learning about it is quite different from how we operate in our day-to-day lives. In our daily lives, we're focused mostly on what we see on the surface. And I'll give you an example from life coaching. Let's say you want to lose some weight or some fat, and you have your current weight, and then you have your goal weight, which if you're losing weight is going to be lower. And then you devise a plan to go about getting there. So you go on your diet, you do your workout, whatever it is. And then you have your day-to-day, week-to-week plan, and you just simply implement it. Eat this amount, do these workouts, stick to the plan, and you should get the results. And it's just, in a way, math, if you get the calculations right. However, a lot of people run up against problems with the obvious approach. And I'll give you an example of where the shadow, somebody's unconscious part of them that they're not aware of, hence unconscious, trips them up. And I'm going to go with a more extreme one, and maybe this will help you to see it because it's probably not going to be your example. So you get some distance and detachment from it so you can understand how this might work. The myth of what you see is all there is causes this blind spot in people who think, well, they're looking at the things that they're seeing, the obvious calculations, the numbers, the plan from where you are currently to where you want to be, and then you simply close the gap by following the plan. the diet, workout plan, etc. And then you get a case where, I'll give you real life examples. A woman who was raped as a child and has a part of her that's decided that if she stays unattractive sexually or physically, then men want to take advantage of her. And that is a strategy. And in fact, it can work. And she adopted that strategy when she was young, and it's now suppressed and repressed, but the behavior stayed on. So she continues to overeat, self-sabotage in her diet, maybe skip some workouts over time to just make sure that she stays a certain appearance to prevent herself from getting taken advantage of. But because it's in her shadow, it's unconscious, and she doesn't understand why she keeps failing at the workouts and diets. And now she's obese, and she's been that way for quite a long time as a protective mechanism that she's unaware of, because it's her shadow doing it. Her shadow is being lazy or gluttonous from her perspective. Why is this part of me just not motivated? And in fact, if you do the therapeutic work and you get to know this part, if she were to get to know the shadow part, she would discover that it's attached to this coping mechanism, this coping strategy that she decided on early on in life and have forgotten or purposely suppressed the memory of, detached the origin of it from the behavior of it, and the behavior stayed on, and the origin has been pushed in the shadows. That part of her that keeps sabotaging her in her diet and exercise plans and just losing the fat keeps coming in to sabotage it, and she's not aware of why this is happening because it's her shadow. It's one of her shadow parts. And you'll notice that this is kind of an obvious way in which a shadow can self-sabotage. Now I'm going to give you an example that probably hits home more for you, knowing my listeners, majority of them are men. So for you, it might be, here's an example. You have certain goals when it comes to your dating life, and at odd times, you end up self-sabotaging. Maybe it's right from the beginning when you become so anxious and nervous that your mind goes blank, or your mouth gets really dry, or you just blurt out stupid stuff. All right. This is a form of self-sabotage, and there could be many reasons why a shadow part of you is keeping you safe by doing that. Right? That it's preventing you from getting rejected, for example. That's pretty common. A part of you that doesn't want to take risks, because if you put yourself out there, then you could get rejected. So it's better to just not even try. And then there are parts of you that are on the surface, and those are the goal-oriented ones. In IFS therapy, we refer to those as the managers. And the manager parts are out there, and they're more obvious. And they're the ones who are setting these goals and these plans. And one of them might be around dating. So the manager parts hook up the dates, they do all of the things. And then at certain points, the shadow parts pop in and sabotage things. And you, because you're thinking, you've bought into the myth of what you see is all there is, don't know why. You're kind of a mystery to yourself. You don't know why you self-sabotage. And in fact, the reason why you self-sabotage is because these parts that are hidden in your shadow, in the shadows, so to speak, are sabotaging you to prevent you, to keep you safe, to prevent you from putting yourself out there. As an example, and it could work in many different ways. I'm going to cover some of the more common ways, but maybe these two examples might already resonate with you. So that's the myth of what you see is all there is. If you buy into this myth, you're not going to get very far in understanding yourself or in finding inner harmony or being at ease in life or finding lasting fulfillment or happiness or stepping into potential of your full power, because you're not able to access these very powerful shadow parts of you that have been exiled. The second myth is that the shadow is just one thing. And this is a myth that may be less common because this myth would only occur if you already have done some research into the shadow. So if you don't know the shadow, the term has been popularized, or maybe the most famous proponent of it is Carl Jung. He is the pioneer of this concept. So we're all indebted to him and his voluminous writings, especially on this concept for the shadow, and of course of the persona and so on. And for what I've seen is just in my research on the secondary literature, so to speak, the videos, the content, all that on the shadow, one of the biggest mistakes that people make is referring to it and thinking about it, conceptualizing the shadow as just this unitary, monolithic one thing. as if there's just one shadow. So it's important to realize there isn't just one shadow, and I'll explain why when I get to the 3 points. But the shadow is not just one thing. And we have many shadow parts. And so this becomes a lifelong journey of discovering more about ourselves. And even when we've uncovered several parts or a couple dozen parts of us and have helped to unburden any parts that are burdened, when they are us, our parts evolve and step into new roles and morph and shift in different ways. And it's a continuous journey. And just realizing that if you think of the shadow as one thing, you're already falling into this binary trap of either or, black and white, right? And so this is already part of the problem. We have many parts that end up in the shadows. So it's just important to realize that we're not referring to one unitary thing. That's one of the biggest mistakes I see on the internet when it comes to talking about the shadow. Okay, so let's get into the 3 points. The first point is one that I've already kind of previewed, which is that the shadow is really properly understood as your parts, those parts of you that have been disowned or exiled or cut out or pushed down or pushed out in some way, or repressed. As I mentioned, the concept of the shadow was pioneered by Carl Jung. But since then, there's been a lot of advancement in the field of psychotherapy. And one of the most advanced and empirically validated, cutting edge, and I believe just the most effective psychotherapeutic approach overall is IFS therapy. There are plenty of other modalities of psychotherapy that are good as well. And I've been training in several really great modalities that have lots of empirical validation. But overall, I think if you have just going to pick one approach and stick with that, IFS therapy is the best. And IFS stands for Internal Family Systems Therapy. I've done a lot of videos, a lot of podcast episodes describing and explaining what that is. So hopefully you at least have the basics. And even if you don't, you can just understand it as a parts-based psychotherapeutic approach that sees the individual as composed of several subpersonalities, which is another Jungian term, or parts of us that are distinct personalities in and of themselves. And there are, broadly speaking, 3 major categories of parts. And first category parts that you probably would have had contact with already are the manager parts. And those are the parts that are just managing your life. And they correspond to the Jungian concept of the persona. And in order to understand the shadow, you have to understand the persona, because the shadow and the persona are always in contrast to each other. They're sort of like the yin yang of Jungian theory. Okay, so the manager parts, and then there are the exiles. They're exile parts. And the exiles are those young parts of us that are holding the most vulnerability, the pain of the rejection or the lack of love or lack of connection or that lack of approval or attention from our parent caregivers or whomever we were looking to for love when we were young. Young as in from anywhere as early as birth up to 3 years to 13 years to 16 years or so. That's the earlier it is, the stronger the pain, generally speaking, because the fewer resources and less resilience we have at that young age. So the younger the parts are, generally, the younger the exiles are, the more intense the pain they're holding. And they're exiled. They're exiled by our managerial parts, the parts that manage our day-to-day lives. And they're trying to manage it so that these exiles don't come out, because once the exiles come to the surface, come to our consciousness, then we feel the pain. So to prevent us from feeling the pain, we have these coping strategies that end up becoming manager parts, or these manager parts can be thought of as embodying our coping strategies of the achiever or the pleaser or the rebel or the joker or whatever coping strategies we have. And many of us have many different manager parts. I have a few different manager parts that use the intellect and intellectualizing as a kind of coping mechanism for dealing with emotions that might be uncomfortable or painful. And then I also have some warrior type of parts, etc. Hopefully you understand this already, so I don't have to spend another half hour unpacking IFS therapy in parts. So there's manager parts, and then there are exiles. The exiles are the ones in the shadow. So you might think of those first and foremost as holding our shadow parts. But there's another category, it's the third category of parts in IFS therapy that are also in the shadow very often, but they come out more often, which are our firefighter parts. And they're firefighters because they're sort of like emergency parts. They come online when the managers fail to hold back the pain and the vulnerability, and then you begin to feel the pain, and then your firefighter parts step in and they do something drastic or more extreme to prevent the pain from staying there. Okay, so we have those three categories of parts. The firefighters are also in the shadows most of the time. Okay, so there's a much more sophisticated conceptualization of the shadow, and one of them is in IFS therapy. There are other parts-based therapy approaches, like Gestalt therapy, like transformational chair work, in some senses, third wave CBT and schema therapy with its modes is a kind of parts work, though it's not particularly deep, because one of the assumptions is when you've healed it, it just disappears, and that's not the case. I recommend IFS therapy. If you want to go deeper in this, that's probably the best modality overall to dive into, to understand your shadow and integrate it. Just realize that the concept or the term shadow is a Jungian term, so that'll be more common in psychodynamic therapy or Jungian therapy. In IFS, we would refer to the shadow parts as firefighter parts or exiles. Okay, so just pointing out there's a richer conceptualization of those parts of us that are in the shadows. Okay, the second point is that unless you get to know your shadow parts, or the parts in the shadows, and integrate them, and part of that integration is unburdening and healing them of their burdens that they're carrying from the early traumatic situations or mini traumas, that without doing the shadow work, it'll be almost impossible in the long run for you to find happiness or lasting fulfillment. It will also be very difficult for you to be effective in a lot of different situations. You might, by over-relying on some manager parts, be effective in limited contexts for a certain amount of time, maybe several years, could be a decade or two. But after a while, they'll get tired. And part of the reason why they get tired, these parts of us that are the achiever or the striver or whatever it is, they get tired because not only are they doing the work, they're also holding back these shadow parts. And that's going to result in more and more inner conflict in you over time. And it will really impact your success in dating and relationships. Now, especially in relationships, because dating really is just the first inning out of the whole season. Relationships are just in terms of time and the challenges and the evolving nature, the different phases of a long-term relationship are far more challenging than the dating situation. So just to get good at dating, in other words, for men, especially when they think of getting good at dating, what that means is they date lots of attractive women and hook up and so on. And they have a thriving dating life, meaning they just date lots and lots of beautiful women or women that they are attracted to. It's possible to rely on a manager part, but often the manager parts aren't very sexy. The manager parts, generally speaking, are there for our day-to-day life. And when it comes to our dating life, unless you can access your shadow parts, you're not going to be able to access that playfulness, adventurousness, that easygoing nature. And for many men, not even being able to access their assertiveness or their socially dominant parts of them. And for some of them, not being able to access that humor because it requires some relaxation. And big part of the shadow for almost everybody growing up in the modern world and pre-modern world are our sexual parts. They're almost always in the shadows, our lustful parts. And unless you can get to know them and have them come under your leadership and integrate them into your overall inner system, they will either sabotage you or you'll Jekyll and Hyde. Referring here to Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, where you're going from one extreme to the other. And there's no harmony and there's no integration. And without that harmony and integration, there's no long-term happiness or fulfillment. So this all comes down to shadow work. And if you haven't done it, This could be a major reason why you're hitting the limits of your effectiveness in your dating life, in your social life, especially in your relationships, because for sure, in an intimate relationship over time, it'll take just a matter of a year or two before your shadow parts start to come out and sabotage things in the relationship. And if it's not clear why that's the case, it's really important that you get clear. So what you'll discover is in a long-term relationship, the parts of us ourselves that we've disowned in ourselves, that we've pushed into the shadows, that we've exiled into the shadows, we will do the same to those parts in our partner. And in fact, the parts of us that we have exiled into our shadows, we are actually attracted to the corresponding parts in another person. And that accounts for a lot of the chemistry that happens in the dating context. All of this is unconscious, of course. It's part of what it means that they're in the shadows. They're in our unconscious. So we're unconsciously having this chemistry with somebody that is reminding us of the parts of ourselves that we've exiled into our shadows. And then over time, we do to them and their parts what we did to ourselves. Here's an easy example that I see a lot, that I've experienced early on in my dating life, was as a good Christian boy growing up in a good goody two-shoes, following all the rules, getting all the A's, obeying my parents, that whole thing. Well, to a certain extent, I was obeying them. But I was definitely an achiever, pleaser. And as a result, I exiled the parts of myself that were wild and maybe more sexually out there and more of just like party boy, right? Because I couldn't be those things, or my parents would have, in fact, punished me every time I tried to be those things. So I adapted, and I adapted by exiling those parts of me. Of course, they would sabotage me in the shadows, so to speak. Like when I'm on my own, I might wander down the streets of Montreal as a freshman, first time living away from home, and wander into a strip club, and then feel really dirty and guilty afterwards because I'm supposed to be a good Christian boy, that kind of Jekyll and hiding. And of course, the type of women that I had chemistry with once I started getting good at dating were the more drama-prone women. And that continued all the way for many years. And I didn't understand why. In fact, this is very common for pickup coaches and dating coaches because we start out as good students, but we actually didn't get to know some other parts of our shadows. In order to be good at dating, we had to get to know some parts of our shadows that were related to sexuality and so forth, but we didn't integrate them into our broader system. And as a result, what happens in a relationship is a lot of these guys who are goody two-shoes end up trying to control the girlfriend that they got, because what attracted him to her in the first place was her kind of wild, sexy nature, that she turned heads and he enjoyed having her on his arm and got to, show her off and feel special as a result and all of that. And then a year or two or three into the relationship, now it becomes a chore to have to deal with her now wild party nature. And he now wants, because he's now going back into his comfort zone. Now he's going back to his manager parts. He's doing to her the sexy parts what he did to his own sexual parts, which is to suppress them. And he's trying to get her to dress less revealing and to go out less often with her girlfriends and to party less. And of course, that control over her, because those are her dominant parts, she will rebel against that and it will sabotage the relationship. The relationship will fall apart because now he's trying to control her because he's not comfortable with her sexual nature anymore, because that's what he did to his own parts, threw them into the shadows, banished them into the shadows. But that's actually what attracted him to her in the first place. And you'll notice that for all of you who have been in relationships that last past 3 years, you can ask yourself this question just to kind of reflect for yourself and to notice that the very things that attracted you most in the beginning annoyed you most later on, 2 or 3 years in. Do you struggle in your interactions with women or in your intimate relationship? Are fear, shame, or neediness sabotaging your relationships or attractiveness? In my Platinum Partnership Program, you'll discover how to transform your psychological issues, improve your success with women, and uncover your true self. Get access to all my current and future online courses by applying for the Platinum Partnership today at davidtianphd.com /platinum. And that's a good segue to the third point, which is just to point out in addressing the myth that the shadow is just one thing, that there are different types of shadow parts that we have that are common. And I'm going to go over some of the more common shadow parts. And you can see them when you notice if you have any strong emotions against something, a strong emotion against something. And here's an easy example: lust. And that's a big one for a lot of nice guys or guys who took the achiever-pleaser route. It's going to be a lot less common for guys who were rebels or took the rebel route of coping strategy and have rebel parts dominate their lives. But for those of us that are, like myself, achievers or pleasers, or those who adopted the recluse or loner coping strategy, and it's that we inherited sexual shame. And some to a lot greater degree than others. Sexual shame can come from your religion, from your parents. Most parents have not been equipped to deal with the sexual natures of their children. So it's a very common thing to be shamed around your genitalia or lustful sexual thoughts or any kind of sexual content or sexual matter. And it could also be in your society as a whole. And this is very common as well. So it's normal for us to shame our sexual parts, the parts of us that have sexual desire. You might have been brought up to think that sex is sinful. And I was in an conservative evangelical community that was talking about a community, it's like worldwide, that believed this. Oddly, of course, you have to have sex in order to have children, and having children was a good thing. So I'm waiting to see evangelical sex shops, because if you're a married couple, you ought to be able to spice up your sex life, though I haven't seen any of that, because there's sexual shame that they're laboring under. You can always email me if you find an evangelical sex shop. I haven't bothered to Google it. But that's part of the burden, the kind of legacy burden that we've inherited as the children of conservative parents or cultures or communities or religions. And as a result, we push into the shadows, we exile, banish into the shadows the parts of us that are holding the sexual desire. From an evolutionary perspective, of course, it is a healthy thing. Even from a medical perspective, even from a common sense perspective, sex is a necessary thing, procreation of our species. Of course, there are extremes that if lust leads to overriding somebody else's free will, etc., in other words, rape, it's obviously bad. But if you go from either rape or nothing at all, I'm sure it's like, don't even approach it. Just having any sexual thoughts, even having a hard-on is something to be ashamed of. Being aroused is something to be ashamed of. Well, then, of course, part of your shadow, or what's in the shadows for you, are your sexual parts. And no wonder it's hard for you to be sexually attractive if you've banished your sexual parts. So for a lot of guys who are morally judgmental, do you have strong emotions against guys who have owned their sexual natures? Guys who are men who are outwardly sexual, who have unashamedly and unapologetically claimed their sexual natures. They enjoy sex. They're good at it. It's a healthy thing. They're very comfortable with their sexuality. They might dress in ways that are more sexual in nature, even men. Now, you might have strong emotions against women who have owned their sexuality. And on the outside, you are showing that you're going to stand with these strong emotions against women who show more skin or who dress in figure-fitting, hugging clothing, more sexual clothing, and you might judge them morally and just shame them. But in fact, if you would really admit it to yourself, if you look at your browser and the porn that you're watching, clearly you have these parts of you that also like this. Of course, you like sexually attractive women, but you shame them. So you have this Jekyll and Hyde relationship to sexuality because it's in your shadows and you haven't explored that, come to understand it and integrate it into your overall system. This is really common among men who are bad with women, because one of the reasons they're bad with women is because they haven't integrated the sexual parts of them. They've simply exiled and banished them into their shadows because that's what happened. That was the way that they adjusted to mom or dad or their community or their society. and adapting in some way by banishing or exiling those parts of themselves. Another common example is a strong emotion against anger. And there are a lot of guys who don't know how to deal with anger, especially in themselves, but also in others. And they're hypersensitive to any hints of anger that they might see in or interpret as aggression. And this is also very common among men who aren't that great with women, is that because they haven't owned those parts of themselves that they can channel that anger, that have that assertiveness, that enjoy that aggression, and instead they put it into their shadows. By so doing, they have no control over their anger, and they're afraid of their own anger. And because they're afraid of their own anger, because they can't control it, because, oh, watch out, if this guy ever loses it, he's going to do some really crazy stuff. That's what he's thinking and afraid of. He is hypersensitive to that in others and is afraid of that in others. But of course, he's also attracted unconsciously to others who are able to control it or who have it and wield it, the power over anger or that aggressive energy. And they end up in relationships that trigger them constantly. Maybe with authority figures, males who are more dominant and show that they're not afraid of anger. But on the other hand, they're also judging those very men. And so there's always this, what I was referring to, this Jekyll and Hyde, because of their shadow, because they haven't explored it and owned it and integrated it. They have this under the surface attraction and above the surface kind of disgust against it. And they're constantly going in and out. It's sort of like how most boys feel about porn. They're secretly attracted to it because they're doing it and using it. And then on the outside, they really want nothing to do with it whatsoever, and they feel shame even at the thought of it. And they end up judging themselves, the parts of them that are sexual or are enjoying the little bit of sexual exposure that they can get in the shadows, literally, right? In the dark. Maybe it's not the dark, but just in the privacy of their room. And it's the same with anger. So I moved back to lust there for a second. It's the same with anger. Another example that's very common for achievers to have in their shadows are parts of them that they judge to be lazy. They're very afraid that they'll give in to laziness. This is why it's so hard for them to let go of this toxic neurotic value system that has the belief that your worth is pegged to your productivity or your achievement, that you have to earn your worthiness for love. They have such a hard time letting that go because if they do, they're afraid that they'll fall back into or fall into laziness because they haven't actually understood the parts of themselves that they see as lazy, that they judge as lazy. And I believe that there are actually no parts that are actually lazy because being lazy is a symptom of overworked, right? Maybe you just need to rest and recover, or it could be that you don't understand this part of you. So a lot of parents in my generation, growing up in the 80s and 90s, judged kids who played video games as lazy because they were lazy because they didn't do their math homework. But in fact, nowadays, you could make millions of dollars playing video games. You could become a professional e-athlete playing video games. You know, that wasn't available to us back then. But like, it's not that they were lazy. It's that they were very energetic doing things that the parents just didn't understand and they didn't see the potential for. And that could be the same with my generation of Asian Canadians looked down on things that didn't lead to good grades. So this could be any kind of extracurricular activity. Like you're encouraged to do extracurriculars because it looks good on your college application, but no more than that. So if you spent too much time practicing, I don't know, basketball or football or whatever, and that didn't translate to your grades, your parents are going to be like, well, what are you going to be, a professional athlete? You know, the chances of that happening are so low that they will actually look at you going to like playing basketball, like clearly the opposite of laziness, like doing a sport, as laziness because you're not studying, because it's not what they want you to do. And it's the same with the way we treat our parts. We think we have lazy parts, but we just have parts that are interested in other stuff. And because they're not interested in the same things that our manager parts are interested in, making more money, getting more women, or whatever it is, we judge them as lazy and we banish them to the shadows. And we're afraid that if we rest, then we'll give in to this laziness. And, you know, our achiever parts, we as achievers have, if you're still an achiever and identify with that fully, you probably have not gotten to know those parts of yourself that you judge as lazy and understood them and integrated them into your system. Because if you get to know them better, they're either overworked and they're like signaling to you, you're going to burn out real soon. Take a break. And that laziness is actually a need for recovery time. Or they're actually just motivated to do something different from what your achiever parts are motivated to do. And you'll only discover that and come into the fullness of your fulfillment if you get to know those shadow parts and integrate them into your system. Another great example is gluttony. So for those athletes out there who are very disciplined and maintaining a hard body, all that stuff, and I've been there. If you ever see me now, I'm clearly not there, but I've been there for several years, maintaining a pretty decent six-pack and banishing those parts of myself that enjoyed the taste of food. Like part of, in my 30s, getting to a six-pack and then maintaining it was to stop eating for enjoyment. Like you still want to, but there's probably going to be a period for most of us men who you want to have, like the cleanest food is chicken breast with no seasoning. So my trainer used to just boil his chicken breast and put a little dash of salt on it. And even that would be a kind of a no-no, but he's like, yeah, I'm going to, put a little bit of salt and just plain broccoli, like just chicken broccoli. That's it, as like 6 days a week. In fact, it was so tasteless that I met guys that I became friends with who ground their food, or they would blend it so that they don't have to really taste it. They could just gulp it down. And I've been there. So I didn't go to the extent of blending it all, but I did blend some of it. That requires a banishing of those parts of us that we're afraid will start to like the taste of food again, and then we'll be back to overdoing it. And so not getting to know those parts of ourselves that enjoy food and having a kind of negotiation with them, getting to know ways of meeting their needs in healthier ways and integrating them into the system, and instead just banishing them into the shadows. And that's a relatively easy one to undo, because that's the example I gave was one that I discovered in my 30s. But there are some of us who have eating disorders, or maybe you have had a love-hate relationship with food or with anything. Food is just sort of a placeholder, right? It could be any substance. It could be any adrenaline rush, any kind of quote unquote substance that you have a love-hate relationship with. If you have that, if you see that love-hate relationship with something and you can't shake it and you go from extremes, either overindulging or pushing it out completely, here you're dealing with the shadow part. And I've seen this also with those who, I know a lot of young guys who, when they got drunk, they did something embarrassing. And as a result, they have banished alcohol from their lives completely. And of course, this is applauded by the health community. Of course, it is healthier if not to drink at all. But it depends on the motivation you're doing it. So if you're doing it because you want to exile those parts of you that come out when you're drunk, and you prefer not to deal with that at all, so you push that into your shadows, well, then those parts are still there. And if you let go of that tightly wound, anal retentive, tightly wound, like rigid control over your life, that strictness, then you'll begin to see those parts of yourself that are still there. They're still parts of you, but you've exiled into the shadows. And until you do that, until you integrate them and have this inner harmony, well, then you won't have inner harmony. You won't have inner power. You won't be able to access the fun-loving, playful, really adventurous parts of you that are very likely linked to what comes out of you when you let go of your inhibitions when you drink, which is what will happen. It puts to rest some of your prefrontal cortex, and your managerial parts kind of get numbed, or numb's the wrong word. They can anesthetize, so they fall back. And then these other parts come out to play, so to speak. And you'll never really feel fully at ease in life. And because of that, you'll never find fulfillment or happiness unless you do your shadow work in relation to these substances that you've been putting so much energy into repressing and that are so afraid of coming out. And finally, I'll give one more example to bring it home. And those are the parts of us that are in the shadows, that have been banished into the shadows, that for men are our feminine parts. And I've worked with men who, when they go inside to discover the parts of themselves, they might find a part that presents as a female. And they might be shocked at first, but this is actually, there's nothing wrong with this, obviously, but it might even be a good thing. And what it's showing is, because there's feminine and masculine in every human being, what it's showing is the feminine parts are finally feeling free enough and trusting the leadership of that client's true self to come out and be seen and to be heard. And unless you own your well, let's not say own the feminine, unless you understand and integrate the feminine parts of you, and if you just keep in them in the shadows, then you'll never actually come into the fullness of your sexual power or your full attractiveness or your happiness or fulfillment in life. You'll always have a love-hate relationship to chaos and order and be unable to be comfortable enough with the feminine to be able to dance with it, so to speak, to be able to integrate that and have that come out in you. Here's an easy example. There's a great movie called American Beauty. It cleaned up at the Oscars when the year it came out, starring Kevin Spacey and some other big stars. And there was one major character in that movie who was a military type of father, and he was very afraid that his teenage son was gay. And his teenage son was not gay at all in the movie. So he had a girlfriend, the whole thing. But the father kept seeing all of these signs and reading into it that his son was gay. And he kept shaming him because he was so insecure. Well, anyway, you'll find out why towards the end. But if you know anything about the shadow, you can see it already in the movie, where he's shaming and so afraid of the feminine in his son. And at the end of the movie, he makes a come on to Kevin Spacey's character. He tries to kiss him. And then Kevin Spacey's character pushes him away and it's like, hey, no hard feelings. I'm just, it's not the way I am. And then that man, of course, and it's kind of a caricature because it's so extreme, but this is very telling, I think, as an illustration of what is happening in the minds of most men who are under the weight of toxic masculinity, is that they're so afraid of their feminine parts that they are so attracted to it. Now, if you've integrated your feminine parts and you're straight, then you won't have strong emotions against homosexuality. It's almost like the stronger of an emotion you have against something, the more that is obvious as a part that's in your shadow. And it's a strong emotion of hate or an outward push against or disgust against it. That's very often your shadow. Instead of having a strong emotion of hate against it, the mature reaction might be compassion. Your heart goes out to that person. It might be seeing the value in it. It might even be a laugh or a smile of humor, seeing that in the feminine. Some examples of sexually attractive men who've integrated their feminine parts are Prince is a great and an easy example. Another example is almost all glam rock stars, almost all male performers in music, in dance especially, in the arts. Because what the feminine does is, the feminine energy is about embracing the wild nature of our emotions. And it's also nurturing and compassionate and kind and enveloping, right? Just going and giving a big hug or being with or feeling with. Those are all aspects of our feminine parts. And very often men who are afraid of the feminine and push their feminine parts into the shadows end up being the opposite of that. And as a result, their lives are overly rigid and desiccated and lacking in passion. And because of that, their lives are also lacking in fulfillment and ease. There's a lot more to say about the feminine, the masculine, about discovering our shadow parts in relation to the feminine and the masculine, in relation to lust and sexual desire, in relation to anger and assertiveness. And I've created a course that dives deep into all of this and walks you through the process of learning about and discovering those aspects of yourself. And that course is called Rock Solid Relationships, and it's paired with another course called Masculine Mastery. And it's a 10-week course. There's a bonus module in there, so it's 11 weeks. And it's super comprehensive and deep. I highly recommend it, obviously, for everyone. And it'll come with the Platinum Partnership if you choose to go all in on that. Or you can get it separately on its own. And if this is something that interests you, you should check it out on my homepage, davidtianphd.com, or you can get it as part of the Platinum Partnership. But those are some examples of a common shadow parts that men have, that they've banished, that we have exiled commonly into our shadows. Okay, to recap the 3 points, I covered what the shadow is and contrasted that with a more sophisticated understanding of our parts and different types of parts. Then I went into how the shadow impacts our lives in terms of our happiness and fulfillment or lack thereof, in terms of our effectiveness in a variety of life situations, and how it impacts our effectiveness and success in dating and especially in relationships. And then I finished off with giving some examples of different types of shadow parts that men commonly have in their shadow, right? So you might notice this when you have a strong emotion of hate or disgust against something. And I gave as examples against sexual desire, against anger, but also against laziness or gluttony. And then I ended with just mentioning the strong emotions of hate against the feminine within. Okay, so we covered, it's like a big, broad introduction to the shadow and the shadow parts. It's super important, as I pointed out throughout this episode, of how important it is for our long-term happiness and fulfillment to get to know our shadow parts and to integrate them into our overall system. I've gone through myself all of these different phases of learning about the shadow, of repressing it, being subject to the self-sabotaging nature of a life ignorant of shadow, and of discovering the shadow parts, starting out with the ones that are more to the surface for my needs, of discovering and integrating the parts of my shadow that are related to sexual desire and assertiveness and dominance and so on. And then to get to the point of noticing that shadow parts also include our inner child parts. Actually, that's something I hadn't mentioned because it's later on in the process for most men. And as a result of that turning point of getting to the vulnerability, our exiled parts are in our shadows, that then that therapeutic process really came in strongly. And that's something that I've covered in a lot of other episodes. This one, I focused on the early stages of getting to know those a little more closer to the surface shadow parts. But I've gone through all of these and have experienced the downsides of leading to even to the brink of suicide as a result of not understanding the shadow and these unconscious parts of me and being able to turn inwards to them instead of getting sucked into the myth of what you see is all there is, which is what I believed in. I bought into that myth for 3.5 decades of my life. And as a result, there's lots of self-sabotaging, but also as a result of trying to push back the shadow parts that I didn't even know were there. They were in my unconscious. Lots of achievement-oriented willpower and discipline and over-reliance on that and the pain that results in the long run. So I get it if you don't want anything to do with the unconscious, you think it's all bullshit or something like that. I don't know why you'd still be listening to this if that was you, but maybe you have friends like that, and I get it, and it's okay. And at some point, hopefully, it will connect with them because they will be in that pain. Hopefully, they'll be open and self-aware enough to admit to themselves that pain. Okay, so it's really great that you are still listening to this. It's really important that you pay attention to this concept of the shadow and that you turn inwards to find it, that you uncover, understand, and integrate your shadow parts. Because without that, you will not be able to find inner harmony or be at ease or find lasting fulfillment or lasting happiness. And you will not be able to be effective and find your potential of your power in a variety of life situations. So invest for you in your life. And if you invest now in understanding your shadow and your shadow parts, this will result in a lifetime of payoff and a whole lifetime journey of joy and fulfillment and uncovering more and more power in your life. In the next episode, I'll be covering what to do about it. How do you then go about discovering your shadow parts and integrating them into your life? How do you do it? So the how to, I'm going to be covering that in the next episode. Come back for the next episode for that. I really appreciate all the awesome feedback you've been giving to me about the podcast episode so far. I'd appreciate if you have any feedback at all about this to share that with me. Also, if you benefited from this episode or any of them, please share them with your friends or anyone that you think would benefit from it. And if you can, leave a rating for us on Apple Podcasts. It also helps. And I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. Until then, David Tian, signing out.